Well, good afternoon. It's great to see you all this afternoon. I'm glad that you've chosen to be here once again. I'm glad you've chosen to help with the study and to attend. Last class period, we talked about the history of the Jewish people. We talked about all the way from the Babylonian captivity, if you remember, all the way to 70 AD and the conquest of Israel by the Romans. And we learned a lot in that study, and so you, like we always say, you don't necessarily need to be here for every study, but what we did learn in that study was that in those 400 years of what we call silence, a lot actually happened. So between your Old Testament page and your New Testament page, we did learn that a lot of things happened. So today, we're going to talk about the Jewish life in Palestine. We're going to talk about the Jewish context of Jesus and the early church. So while we went over the history our last class period, what we didn't really get into was the day-to-day life and struggles of the Jewish people in the first century. And so that's what we're going to kind of learn today. We're going to try to keep it sort of brief. I know I think there's something happening this afternoon, some football game or something. Yeah, that people are into. So, we'll let everybody out for that for sure. But as always, if there's anything unclear, any questions that you have, please don't hesitate to ask, interrupt me if you have to, and we'll get through this. So the first thing we need to understand is we're going to start this study from a very high plane. We're going to think about it as if we're looking down from an airplane, 30,000 feet view. We're going to look at the geography of the land that we're talking about. So what we have to understand is when we're looking at the land of Israel, this is a pretty good map I found here, so we can learn a lot about the different places that we're studying here. We see up here on the west coast of Israel, that's the Mediterranean Sea. That's the one border, most obvious, right? Up here, the north border is the Galilee. So all that land around here would be called the Galilee. This is the Sea of Galilee here, that's named after, of course. And as we know from studying our New Testaments, that's where Jesus and John the Baptist came from. That's where a lot of Jesus' ministry started, was in the Galilee, in that large area. The other borders we have are the Jordan River. And so that would be the eastern border of the land. And then the Negev is kind of a desert here, and this would be kind of the southern border. Even farther south down here where we can't really see, there's the Gulf that would actually be the southern border of Israel. What we have to understand is that borders and boundaries in ancient times were not these strict dotted lines as we might have today. They were more general references for the region or area. So when you hear words like Galilee, Judah, Samaria, these were prominent regions in the land, but they weren't necessarily strict boundaries that we might understand as today in our land. For example, if I have a piece of land, then I need to know where is that boundary, right? Where would I put the fence up on that land? This wasn't as strict for ancient times, especially in large areas or nations like this. There are 4 distinct features of the land of Israel that we're going to look at. There was a question last class period about the Gaza Strip. That's this part right here. And this is the coastal plains. So the coastal plains is really all the area down here in Gaza in the south, all the way up here, this little blue triangle, that's Mount Carmel in the north. So what are some things we remember happening at Mount Carmel? The most famous thing that happened at Mount Carmel. Showdown. Right. There's the showdown between Baal and Yahweh, right? The real test to see who was going to light that altar in the Old Testament. And who was there representing God? Elijah, right? He was the prophet that was representing God. What was interesting is we went to Israel last year and we found this mountain. You might think of it as a mountain. It's really a rocky hill more than anything. A lot of these mountains that you read about in the Bible are not these impressive Rockies or even the Appalachian Mountains that we have here. And so these places were kind of mild compared to what you might think in your mind. Also, the rivers are little tiny streams. You probably couldn't even drive a car down them if they were a road. And so a lot of these places are different than you might imagine in your head. But this is the coastal plain, all the way here from Gaza to Mount Carmel in the north. That's what they call the coastal plain. It's very green. It's very fertile. A lot of people live there. Cities, agrarian cultures are built up right there. And then you have what we call the Central Mountains. So they call it the Western Mountains on this map, but it's really these Central Mountains. So all this brownish, sandy area would be a mountainous country. And the highest elevation of these mountains were about 3,000 feet. Jerusalem is right here in the middle of these mountains. It is in the highest point in the mountains, but it's a point we need to remember. Right here in the middle is Jerusalem. Up here in the north is Shechem, and all the way down through here. These are the Central Mountains, so the more mountainous regions that are between the Jordan River and the ocean in the west. The Jordan Valley is this area right here. So they painted it gray, and the reason they did that is because this land is actually below sea level. It's so fertile because it is a wet, very fertile land, and it's made up of some soil that is world-renowned for growing crops. And it has been for a long time because every year the Jordan floods. The water comes out over to all this gray area, and that's why it's so green right here. If you remember, does anybody remember a story in the Bible about this land and how green it was in the time of the Old Testament? Yeah, well, that was all the land. But when Abraham and Lot were in Genesis, when they were coming into this land, they were sojourners, right? They didn't own anything. But they came out and they looked over the land to decide, well, which way are you going to go? Which way am I going to go? Because they had too many possessions to keep together. And so Abraham told his nephew Lot, he said, you pick one area and I'll go the other way. You just pick whichever one you want. Lot chose this land around here. It was very green, very luscious, and it was near where Sodom and Gomorrah was. And so this was the Jordan Plain. And he picked that land because of its lush green beauty and because of its fertility. The grass was good. The Transjordan is what we call the area on the other side of the Jordan River. It comes all the way from the Jordan River all the way east to these mountains over here. And that would be called the Transjordan. So those are just some things to keep in mind as you study your Bible. As you read, you can kind of have a picture in your mind of what that looks like. Now, there are other things that have to do with the Jewish context of Jesus in the early church. One of the main things that made up the world of Jesus and his followers and the early church was language. This area of Palestine was a trilingual environment. That means there's 3 main languages. Does anybody here speak more than one language? Yeah, fluently. Let's say fluently. We're kind of a mono-language society, very much so. Everything in America is English. You can pretty much get by with anything just by speaking English. And so we're often impressed by people who speak lots of different languages. Me and Emily had a tour guide one time who was from Spain, but he spoke German, he spoke French, he spoke English, and of course he spoke Spanish. He was very talented, and I was impressed by that. But what we have to understand as modern people in America is that for most of history and most of the world, speaking multiple languages without any education, just being able to speak other languages, was kind of a necessity. It was the norm for most people. And so there are 3 main languages we need to learn about if we're going to understand the Jewish context of Jesus in the early church. Aramaic is the first one, Hebrew, and then Greek. So a little bit about Aramaic. Aramaic had been the majority language since the Persian Empire, despite the Greek-Roman conquest and influence in the land. So when Babylon took over the land of Palestine, and then they were taken over by Persia, the Persians spoke a pretty much Aramaic language. And so that's kind of been the majority language in that land ever since that happened. all the way up into Jesus' time. It was the majority language. Aramaic is closely related to the Syriac language, which is used today as a living language in some parts of the world. Jesus almost certainly spoke primarily in Aramaic. When you read the words of Jesus in red in your Bible, most likely Jesus was speaking Aramaic, unless he was quoting scripture or quoting some Jewish text, which would have been in Hebrew. Which brings us to our next language. Hebrew is the original language of the Jewish liturgy. The scriptures, as well as other Jewish writings, were all written in Hebrew. Any kind of educated Jew at that time would have been able to read and write in Hebrew. Even today, the Jews continue to read and write in Hebrew in their Jewish liturgy. And that is the religious writing and reading. Aramaic relates to Hebrew in the way that modern English might relate to the writings of the Canterbury Tales. So if you've read the Canterbury Tales, maybe for school, or Beowulf, those old English stories, they're in your language, but you really can't understand them, right? Because it's so distant from it. It's related, but the language is distant. And so that's the way Hebrew and Aramaic kind of are. They're related, similar, but they are separated by a long period of time. Hebrew is a very ancient language. The last language that many people in this culture and this time knew was Greek. Greek was also widely spoken throughout Palestine, especially by the merchants and ruling class. So if you wanted to make any business dealings with another merchant, if you wanted to deal outside of any kind of Jewish context, you would have had to be able to get along in Greek. Now, like I said, for those of us living in single language cultures, we are impressed when people are able to speak multiple languages. But for most of the world, through most of history, speaking 2 to 3 or even 4 languages without a significant education was the norm. The level of literacy in those languages varied from being able to write your name to short informal letters or business contracts. Many who were literate in one language could only speak another language. So, what does it mean? Like we just said, what does it mean to know a language, right? Well, what does it mean to be literate in that language? Maybe you could write out a business contract. Maybe you could just sign your name in that language or whatever. But you couldn't necessarily read and write classic literature in that language. And so there was different levels of varying education. We have a very standardized education in America. And so we think either you can read or you can't. Either you write or you can't. But back then it was a little different. So maybe you could speak Greek, but someone else had to write out your contracts and letters and things like that. Literacy among Jews and Christians was higher. It was a much higher rate back then because of their book culture and their emphasis on sacred text. And so because of that, many people, many Christians and Jews at that time were pretty literate. They could read, they could write. Now, another aspect that we're going to look over this afternoon is the economic life of living in that time and place in first century Palestine. First century Palestine was an agrarian society where the majority of people lived in small rural villages and not necessarily big towns or cities like Jerusalem or Tiberias. Agrarian societies create certain models of power and privilege, but they all emphasize the difference between the different people in those tiers. Okay, so to say that in an easier way is all agrarian societies are different in some ways, but one way that they're all similar is that they emphasize the differences between different classes of people. So let's see how they do that. The highest class in the economic life living in first century Palestine as a Jew would have been the ruling elites. So who was the ruling elites? Those were the rulers. That was the royal family. So Caesar at the time, right? That would have been the very top of the hierarchy. And then his wider body of dependents. Regional elites, royal officials, were next on the list. Royal officials, large landowners, military leaders, wealthy merchants. Pilate, was the governor of Judea at the time. He would have been in this class of people. Municipal elites are the third. And municipal elites are smaller, stable landowners, merchants, and some veterans. Lower level retainers are governing officials. These are like the scribes and the Pharisees when we're reading the New Testament. These would have been the scribes and the priests, not the Pharisees. The scribes and the priests would have been at this kind of lower level retainers. They didn't really have a lot of control, but what they did have control over, they held on to it. Professional class, this would have been people that were professionals at what they did, skilled laborers, smaller merchants, shopkeepers, fishermen, skilled artisans. These are people like stonemasons, silversmiths, fishermen. So some of the apostles would have fallen into this class of people. If you had a trade, you were kind of the backbone of that society. You provided food for people. You provided the work that went into building things, construction, things like that. And then, of course, there's the peasant class. Peasant class would be made up of sustenance farmers and unskilled laborers, right? This is, kind of people like, hold the sign and turn it when I tell you to, right? You're unskilled laborer, you're not professional at anything, and maybe you're working your way up there. So you might think, okay, we're at the peasant class. That's the bottom, right? Well, there's actually another. There's the destitute. In this time, there were beggars, prostitutes, widows, disabled people, infirm, orphans, lepers. These were the people who fell through the cracks in society. They weren't on the scale necessarily. They were at the very bottom. And this is something that was very common in the New Testament. And so this is one of the reasons we always say we don't want to relate everything that happens in the New Testament and say, oh yeah, it's just like what happens today. Because there are a lot of differences between their culture and our culture. But we're not at the bottom yet. There's one more class that's almost separate and on its own in some ways, and that's slaves. Slaves are a class of their own, but anyone could find themselves in this class of slavery if given a failed business venture, for example, or maybe they were on the losing side of a battle or a war. You would find yourself in slavery. So all of these places in this scale, in this hierarchy, while there were upward limits, most people could move up and down the social scale based on famine, political stability, population size, and taxation. So this wasn't just like, oh, okay, you're born a peasant and that's all you are the rest of your life. You maybe could make it up a few rungs. You wouldn't be in a ruling class or the regional elites or anything like that, but you could make it up a few rungs. But you could also find yourself in dire poverty, destitute, or even slavery. It wasn't like because of, in America, maybe it's because of the color of your skin, you might have been a slave. It was more like you had a failed business venture. You're out of money. If you file bankruptcy today, you aren't made a slave, but back then, that's exactly what happened. You can't pay your debts, you're an indentured servant until you paid your debts off. That's how slavery worked in the first century. And through a lot of history, through a lot of places. Jesus' message reached people on all levels of this social ladder, from lepers and prostitutes to fishermen and merchants, and even rulers like Herod and Pilate heard his message. While his message was often spoken to the poor, Jesus resonated with Pharisees and scribes as well. So his message was kind of jumping tiers and went all the way up and down. Now, there were different cultural values back then. So that's what we're going to talk about next, is the cultural values of the Jews in the Jewish context. So what was the cultural values of the Jews in the first century? Well, the first one was family and kinship. This was a big value for people in the first century. In that time, a family consisted of the household and was headed by the household head, which was usually a male, but sometimes female. And then it would consist of the spouse, children, freemen, and slaves, and then your other dependents in your household. Now, what was interesting and different about the first century family and kinship is that the head of the house, they were the head of everything that happened with the people in the household. So the household head was the ultimate source of power and identity for family and the family's social status, their economic status, their religion, and political stances were that of the head of the family. So if you were in a family, then whatever the head of that family said goes. That's what you did. If you disagreed with them politically, if you disagreed with them religiously, it didn't matter. You followed what the head of the family said. You backed them on everything they did. Now, kinship was extended through marriage and birth, like it is today, but it was also extended by other means. The common striving toward a goal or purpose created what you might call a fictive family. Now, these bonds weren't fake necessarily, but they were the result of a common ideal and way of life. Philo of Alexandria, a famous Jew in the old writings of the Jewish people. Philo of Alexandria praises Gentile converts to Judaism for leaving their religion, kin, and way of life to be members of the Jewish family. So there was a way to join in to the family of Jewish people, to maybe a particular family, and that was by kind of clinging on to their way of life, to their views, to their understanding and religion. Jesus makes similar demands of his followers to become a welcoming family. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, in verse 46, this is Jesus. It says, "While Jesus was still talking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and brothers stood outside, seeking to speak with him. Then one who said to him, 'Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak with you.' But he answered and said to the one who told him, 'Who is my mother, and who are my brothers?' And he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, 'Here are my mothers and brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother.'" So Jesus is kind of making a point here, right? Obviously, these people aren't his physical blood relations, but he's making a point that his disciples, those who choose to follow him, are all brothers and sisters. They are all family in certain ways. This comes up a lot in the New Testament, actually. If you want to write down Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 19, that's a great passage to look at. We're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, starting in verse 1. It says, "Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters with all purity." So how are we to treat each other in the household of faith? We are to treat each other as mothers, as fathers, as sisters, as brothers. We're to treat each other as family. So you can see when Jesus is teaching, this big cultural value is family and kinship for these people that he's teaching. But he's telling them to extend in their minds what they think of as family. Family goes beyond just your blood relations. More importantly, your family is members of the church, or the people that follow Christ, his disciples. Paul likewise envisioned the church to be a family in the united household of God. That's what it says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. A household of God. So what's another cultural value that came up a lot? Shame and honor. Honor, then and now, is the quality of having the respect and esteem of your peers. In the world of Jesus, honor could be bestowed by noble birth, impressive skill or ability, or even by social achievements. Honor looked different for men and women. For men, honor came by courage or ability or trustworthiness. For women, honor was acquired through chastity, modesty, and domestic skills, as those described toward the end of Proverbs, in Proverbs 31. So honor looked different for different kinds of people. So what was shame? Shame, then and now, is the lack of honor due to a low social position or some action that caused one to lose face in public. Shame and honor were often used persuasively in the first century to motivate someone to do something by pointing out that it was the honorable thing to do, and to shirk that task may lead to public shame. You can see how those two things are working together. I think one thing we need to remember is this was a big shame and honor culture in the first century. But we would kind of be kidding ourselves to think that we don't live in a shame and honor culture today. You might think, oh, I don't take myself that seriously. It's not that important that I have. Probably, like most of us, desire to have the respect, the esteem of your peers wherever you go. You don't want people to think of you as laughable or as someone who isn't deserving of respect. You want people to think, oh, I should go to that person because they really know what they're doing. They know what they're talking about or something like that. It's different on different relationships, but in a lot of ways, we too are scared of being publicly shamed. And we desire public honor where we go. What groups of people in the first century focused on shame and honor? What are some groups we can think of that are groups of people in the first century that focused on this? Okay, the Sadducees and Pharisees. That's a great example. Who else?
Greeks and Hebrews.
The Greeks, absolutely, they did. So the Greeks, the Romans, right? Do you think they didn't live in a shame and honor society? If anything, they heightened the shame and honor culture in the first century. Who else?
Jews and Gentiles.
Jews, Gentiles, yeah. Pretty much everyone, right? Jews and Gentiles.
Samaritans.
Yeah, the Samaritans. Turn to Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10 points out a group that you may not necessarily think about, a specific group of people you may not think about as really being worried about the shame and honor in their society. Mark chapter 10 and verse 35. It says, Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus, saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant us that we may sit one on your right hand and the other on your left in your glory. But Jesus said to them, You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they said to him, We are able. So Jesus said to them, You will indeed drink the cup that I drink, and with the baptism I am baptized with, you will be baptized. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it is prepared. And when the 10, this is the rest of the disciples, it says, when the 10 heard it, they began to be greatly displeased with James and John. But Jesus called them to himself and said to them, You know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles, they lord it over them, and they're great ones to exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So even Jesus' own disciples, these are people following him everywhere he goes, listening to him preach, studying under him. They're very concerned. Okay, well, you're going to have this new kind of kingdom. It's not going to be what we thought with, the earthly conquest of Rome or anything like that. But whatever the kingdom is, James and John say, can we sit right next to you? Can we be at the highest possible place that humans can be? And Jesus says, you don't understand the kingdom of heaven. Right? The kingdom of heaven isn't like earthly kingdoms. It's not the most honorable at the very top and the most shameful slave at the very bottom. He says, if you want to be at the top in the kingdom of heaven, then you must be a servant to everyone you come in contact with. And if you want to be at the very bottom, then, go ahead and seek earthly honor. Go ahead and seek all of this greatness while you're here on earth. And so even his own disciples, Jesus had to explain this to. This is something that I think we all get caught up in. Even today as Americans, we have this shame and honor culture kind of built in to us, especially those of us who, are concerned with that public face and prestige. So what was another cultural value in the first century? Well, another thing that was very concerning for the people of the first century, the Jews, was purity and pollution. Pure and impure, sacred and common, these classifications touched every part of Jewish life in the first century. Now, for those who aren't familiar with why that was, it was because if you read the Old Testament, if you read the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, there's a lot of laws that had to do with purifying yourself. When you were in, maybe you were around a dead body, then that was something you had to be cleansed before you could go out into society. People like lepers, people who were sick, all these kinds of people who were unclean, and not to mention the kosher food laws, all the different laws about what you could and couldn't eat at the time. This is another one of those things I think we often kind of look down at the people in the first century or the Jews in general for in the Old Testament. Sexual intercourse, bodily discharge, certain foods and drinks, and even childbearing could make one impure. These were huge topics for the first century and are still something we deal with today. So I think we a lot of times think, oh, we don't have that today. We don't have those purity laws. We don't have that purity culture today. I would like to bring up a lot of things, actually, that in our culture we see as clean and unclean. Going to the restroom, that is considered unclean. How do I know that? Because we wash our hands before we leave. Even if you don't touch anything while you're in there, you wash your hands. And if someone goes in there and you see them leave without washing their hands, that person has then become unclean. You don't want to shake their hands. You don't want to let them cook your food, right? The same way with somebody who maybe coughs into their hands. When you see that, maybe the first thought in your head is, I'm not shaking that person's hand, right? Or they sneeze into their hand or something like that. And of course we think, well, that's just germs, right? Everybody knows that we can't touch people who have germs on their hands. But there are a lot of things like that. For example, hygiene. People who don't wear deodorant. People who don't brush their teeth. Those are people we don't necessarily want to be around. Those people are unclean in some way. Even though, for most of human history, we didn't have those luxuries, right? There's things that we eat that we will eat because we think of it as common or clean, but there's other things that we will not eat. I think many people in here probably wouldn't eat a cat or a dog. Maybe even farther than that, eat some kind of rat or something like that. It's just meat, right? It's cooked, but it's unclean. Emily refuses to eat squirrels. No matter how I cook them or how I clean them, if I go squirrel hunting, then I eat by myself. She doesn't eat squirrels. But there's lots of things. I think we all kind of have our own purity, kosher laws in some way. How did Jesus deal with this issue in the New Testament? Turn to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8. In verse 1. It says, when Jesus had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him, and behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing to be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So you can even hear it in the culture. You can even hear it in the words. He wasn't sick. He wasn't diseased. He was unclean. So what would normally happen if somebody touched a leper?
Like outcasts? I know the leopards were, but I think if you touched one,
you were unclean, right? Yeah. If you touched a leper, you became unclean. They transferred their uncleanness to you in some way. It's actually a skin disease, and it's different than the leprosy we have today, probably. But one way or the other, that leprosy could spread. And so if someone touched you with it, you had to do a ceremonial purification. It wasn't a sin, necessarily. To be unclean wasn't to be in sin. But you had to go and follow the steps to become cleansed. So Jesus does this. He reaches out and he touches the leper. But instead of him becoming unclean, the leper is cleansed. There's another story in, we're not going to look at it right now, but in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 15, if you want to go back and look at that later. Luke chapter 7 and 11 through 15, Jesus visits a widow who has just lost her son. And as they're carrying the open casket, he goes by and he touches the open casket. This would have made him unclean. But he had compassion on this widow, and instead of him becoming unclean, the young man rises from the dead. And he can now take care of his mother again. And so you see the same thing that happens. When Jesus touches someone who is unclean, they become clean. So these are just a few cultural values of these people. Family and kinship, shame and honor, purity and pollution. These are absolutely some of the most important and most, I would say, the things that come up the most in the New Testament that we can learn from. Are there any questions on the cultural values before we move on?
I think I was kind of raised with not to seek honor, but to avoid shame.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Remember who you are. Remember who you're representing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so as Christians, we're living, even if we're not seeking honor, we're living not to shame Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so it's kind of interesting how.
Right, but even that looks different today, right? It looks different to not seek shame. Back then may have been, don't serve someone lower than you. That would be shameful. But today, if we're wanting to honor Christ, we don't pass by someone who's in need. You know, that would be shameful. And so that's the way that Christianity, that the religion of Christ really flipped shame and honor on its head. Now, if you want to be seen as honorable in the kingdom of heaven, then you lower yourself to serve others. You know, it's a totally different idea than what the world sees as shame and honor, right? Is there anything else? Okay, well, our next kind of section is on the Jewish sects of people. So the different religions, the different views. There was really 4 options if you were a Jew in the first century. You could be, the first option is a zealot, and that option was to revolt. That was revolution. The Sicarii were the main sect of Jews in the first century. They're actually named for the Hebrew word for dagger. It's because they carried daggers, the Sicarii. They took over Herod's old palace/fortress of Masada during the Roman Jewish War. Their view was, say your prayers, sharpen your swords, and make yourself holy to fight a holy war. And God will give you a military victory over the hordes of darkness. That was their mindset. That's what they did. Option 2, the Pharisees. That was the option of teaching. The community activists. These were what the Pharisees were. The stricter the Pharisee, the more likely they were to relate to the zealots. Who is a very strict Pharisee from the New Testament? Who was a very strict Pharisee? Right, yeah, Saul of Tarsus, that's right, who later became Paul. He says, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He asked the question, zeal? Me, zeal? He said, a Pharisee of Pharisees is who I was. And the stricter the Pharisee, the more they were to kind of fall in line or to understand at least the zealots and their religion. In the early days, Pharisees often had political influences, but by the time Jesus was on the scene, they were more like a pressure group. The aim was to keep the law, especially purity laws, and have their vision for Israel adopted by the masses. If they were all good and said their prayers, maybe they could usher in God's Messiah and the Son of David to come and save them. Option 3 is the Essenes. These are the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Don't worry, we're going to study all about that. This was the dualist option. It was committed to separation from the evil world and waiting for God to do whatever he planned to do, to completely separate from the world. Option 4 was to compromise. This was the belief of the Sadducees. This is the actions of the Sadducees. They believed keep the temple and the sacrifices going, but mostly just get along peacefully with whoever was in charge politically at the time. And maybe they'll throw you a bone every once in a while. This is how the Sadducees operated. So the first thing we need to understand is the Zealots, the revolutionary movements of the Zealots. Now, political stability deteriorated when Rome took control in 63 BC. Remember Pompey, the Roman general who marched into Jerusalem in our last class, and he took Jerusalem, he took Israel, and it became part of Rome. Well, after that happened, the economic pressure led to the forming of several bands of Jewish rebels. Forced out of the normal society, these Jewish rebels pillaged and plundered those who still had property that could be stolen. In AD 6, when Herod Archelaus was deposed, the Romans imposed a new census, which had theological implications, as well as physical implications. As a Jew, participating in the census was to admit that Rome was the rightful rulers of their ancestral land. So this census was kind of giving over to the Roman people, to the Roman rulers. A man named Hezekiah was the first leader of a sect called the Sicarii, what we just mentioned. His son, Judas the Galilean, as he was known, carried the movement, and his 3 sons were crucified under Tiberius, Alexander, in the mid-40s AD. So Judas the Galilean led a revolt against the census. He encouraged Jews to not participate. We need to hold fast to being a Jewish nation and not to listen to the Romans. So don't participate in the census. He went as far as even burning the houses and stealing the livestock of Jews who did register in the census. Roman provocation continued unabated and was often answered by rebellion after rebellion. Procurators were brutal and heavy-handed. Pontius Pilate being the most famous one. Pontius Pilate was actually removed from being the governor of Judea because of his brutal behavior, including killing Jesus of Nazareth. In 41 AD, a huge tinderbox of rebellion was almost lit when Caesar Caligula decided to erect a statue of himself to be placed inside the Jewish temple. The Jews and even his own men advised against such a crass action. Only his early death stopped his plans and what would have been, in all likelihood, an all-out Jewish revolution. In another incident, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a Roman soldier mooned a group of Jews walking into the temple. Enraged, the Jews called on the governor to punish him, to keep his men in line. Fights were started. One of the Jews picked up a stone and threw it at the soldiers. They fought back. In the end, 30,000 people were killed. So as you can see, Jewish revolution under Rome was common, and it wasn't unprovoked. The Romans were terrible rulers. They were evil. They were crass, brutal people. And so it led to a lot of rebellion. The Pharisees were another group. And so this was another option if you were a Jew living in the first century. The Pharisees were another group. And maybe the most important group for us to study if we want to understand the New Testament. Now, the problem is that in the Gospels, the Pharisees are Jesus' primary adversaries. Paul, the apostle, was a Pharisee himself, and the Pharisees dominated the Jewish world after AD 70, and so they're very common. Now, the problem is for most Christians, the word Pharisee, what do you think of when you hear the word Pharisee?
I think of rich and hypocrite.
Okay, rich, hypocrite, that's the main one I was looking for, absolutely. What else? Okay, antagonist, they were the enemy, right? They were the people that were against Jesus. This leads to us kind of thinking of them as a caricature of what they really were. And so if we want to understand the New Testament in its world, we need to understand who the Pharisees were. Jesus' debates with the Pharisees were often insider debates about different visions for the same goal. That goal was the coming of God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. You see, they both wanted the same thing, but it was different visions. Jesus was closer to this sect than any other. This claim is clearly evidenced by his Pharisee followers, including Nicodemus in John chapter 3. Those who invited Jesus to dine at their house in Luke chapter 7, verse 36 through 50. And then another incident where more Pharisees asked him to dine with them. Luke chapter 14, verses 1 through 24. Those who warned Jesus that Herod sought to kill him. Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. And by the fact that many Pharisees even joined the church. Many Pharisees joined the church. Acts chapter 15 and verse 5, the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. If you remember, there was a large group of Pharisees who were Christians. And these Pharisees were concerned that these Gentiles were being let in without being circumcised. And Peter gets up and he gives the long speech about circumcision and why it's actually not important because God has cleansed and purified their heart, and so they don't need to be physically circumcised. So the Pharisees made up a large population of God's people, even after Christ. What were the aims and the ambitions of the Pharisees? One strand of scholarship assumes that the Pharisees had started as a political force advising the Hasmonean dynasty, which is true. If we looked at that actually last class period, how they started. Once the Maccabees were no longer in power, they took on more of a religion-centered role as biblical scholars promoting their own brand of Jewish piety and religion and holiness. Others contend that the Pharisees remained politically active and even participated in various revolutionary movements to effect change to the political status quo. Many questions still remain. Why were they so concerned with purity? Were they really trying to keep the priestly purity codes of Leviticus? And how large was their influence among the common people? The only two Jewish sects to emerge after AD 70, can anybody tell me what they are? The two sects to emerge after AD 70? The first one is Pharisees. The second one is Christianity. That's the only other Jewish sect to come out of AD 70, is Pharisees and Christianity. The Pharisees numbered several thousand based on a literary source for their activity outside of Judea. Pharisees focused on their mission to make Israel ceremonially pure. They were very active in transmitting their message. They were very good at transmitting their message as well. What mattered was not religion, not inward morality, but the eschatology of God's kingdom being revealed on earth. This was the coming of God's kingdom. That's what they were really focused on. They were obsessed with the outward purity and cleansing, Sabbaths, festivals, vows, tithing, these physical representations. But like we said, they were hoping for God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. And like we said, this is exactly the same thing that Jesus was doing, bringing God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. But those meant two different things for these two different groups of people. The clash between Jesus and the Pharisees must be seen as a misguided political agenda, more so than an all-out war. They wanted to set everything right in order to enable God to get Rome out of the way so that they could be God's people again. Jesus wanted to prepare the people to start understanding their election differently so that God could call his people to work in and through every nation in order to bring about God's total rule on earth as in heaven. So what's the next sect that we're going to look at? The Sadducees, the priests, and the aristocrats. This was a very interesting part for me to study because I came to understand a lot of things that when I read the New Testament, I really didn't understand very well. The majority of priests were not necessarily aristocrats, and most did not even didn't even live in Jerusalem. They and the Levites who assisted them were completely dependent on the tithing of the community. So that tithe that was given by the people in the community, that actually went to supporting the priests, not just in Jerusalem, but all throughout the land. Priests represented official mainline Judaism. Those who lived outside Jerusalem made the journey in groups to perform the rituals yearly, and they served as judges and arbiters the rest of the year, as well as teachers and experts in the law. That's who the priests were. So you might have a priest in every local town that you went in. And they served different functions, but they were kind of like what we might think of the justice of the peace today. That's kind of they were the courthouse, they were the arbiters, the experts in the law, things like that. Like we said, priests represented official mainline Judaism. The high priest sat at the top of this hierarchy. He is chosen from among the aristocratic chief priests who were formed in the first century. Based in Jerusalem, the chief priests wielded considerable power and were made up of a few tight-knit, inbred families. These families made up the pinnacle of Jewish aristocracy, and they were who Roman governors dealt with and held responsible for the actions of the Jewish people. So, I know that was a lot, but this is the part that I was telling you that really opened my eyes to a lot of things in the New Testament. So where in the Old Testament do you read about the chief priests and the forming of the chief priests? It's not there, right? I never read anything about a chief priest in the Old Testament. That's because this was a group formed in the first century. What they were was a group of very rich, very wealthy families of Jewish people. They were at the very top of the Jewish hierarchy. So if you were a Jew, that was the very top of the place to be. Yes?
So they didn't have to be Levites?
They were.
Oh, they all were?
Yes, the priest class were all Levites. Yeah, that's right. Not all Levites were priests, but all priests were Levites. Some of the other Levites were assistants. They helped carry things, just like in the Old Testament. But the chief priest, for example, were a few families, 3, 4 maybe families, and they were very tight-knit, had lots of money, and they wielded power. Now, where did they get all this power? It came from being in charge of the temple. And so the chief priests were in charge of the temple in Jerusalem. And out of the chief priest was elected the high priest. So that's why you see the high priest in the New Testament. They were chosen out of that group. Now, these families, like I said, they made up the pinnacle of Jewish aristocracy. And they had power and control. And they had religious and economic power. This all came from the temple. The temple gave them legitimacy. So that's why they, it's like, well, how do you know you're doing the right thing? How do you know you're following God's will? It's like, well, I don't know, but I'm in charge of the temple. So that counts for something. So people listened to them because they were ministering in the temple, which was where God's presence dwelled. The priestly worldview was encapsulated in the temple. Those outside of Jerusalem did everything they did in service and reverence to the temple. Those inside the city dwelt every day in and around the temple. It was the source of their power and control. It had religious and economic power, and it gave them legitimacy. The economic power is because of the temple tax and the tithe that would go there and be spread out to the other priests. Most chief priests and aristocrats seem to be what we call Sadducees. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that they believed in free will. Now, this is kind of a side note. What that means, that they believed in free will, is more of a political statement than it is a religious statement. They believed in kind of this idea, you might hear people say today, God helps those who help themselves. And so they compromised with the Roman dictators because it got them in good with their rulers. So they said, well, we want to be this high class, then we need to kind of give in and do whatever Rome wants us to do. And people who have less power don't necessarily think God helps those who help themselves. Instead, what do they think? We wait and pray, and we hope God saves us, because they don't have any power. They can't change anything. So this is kind of the plight that we see the Sadducees in. The Sadducees had no time for anything but the Torah. What is the Torah? first 5 books of Moses, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That was all they believed in. They didn't believe in the prophets. They didn't believe in the Psalms. Instead, they only studied Torah. They were always the ultra-conservative party. They were unwilling to let anything new in. They were conservative on every issue because it might corrupt their power if they let something new in. They wanted to keep things the way they were, or they were at the top. The Sadducees also denied the doctrine of resurrection. This doctrine was linked to God's vindication and rescue of his people for those in power. As the ones who were in power, they didn't want to believe in this situation where God would come and rescue the people from those in power. They resented that belief. They got along great with their Roman bosses, and they were quite comfortable without a Messiah or a resurrection rocking the boat. They wanted to keep things the way they were. Now, the Sadducees, while powerful, were not good at expanding their influence. That was more of a Pharisee thing. They, in fact, wanted to keep the Sadducees, they wanted to keep that belief as kind of the top realm of society. They didn't want to open it up for common folks. And so the Pharisees really held the corner on influencing the way people thought, not the Sadducees. So this brings us to our next worldview, the Essenes. I think this is a very interesting one, mostly for the fact that we don't know very much about the Essenes. Very little. They're not mentioned even once in the New Testament, although they are mentioned in the works of Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny. Some speculate that John the Baptist even had ties with the Essenes, but this isn't necessarily backed up in the Bible, so we're not sure if this is true or not. They were known for their separatist beliefs. They had a high concern for ritual purity, corporate reading of Scripture, refusal to own slaves, and they shared property. And they also shared communal meals. Everything they did was together. Some Essenes lived in the southwest quarter of Jerusalem. Thus, if you go to Jerusalem today, there's what is called the Essene Gate in the southwest corner. Some lived on the shore of the Dead Sea. There's this one particular group that I want to talk about this afternoon. One group inhabited the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, a place called Qumran, after the Hasmonean priest-king power grab. If you remember from our last class, the Hasmoneans, how they kind of grabbed that priest-king office and shared it. Well, after that happened, that seems like that's it. We're not playing this game. We're going to leave, and we're going to wait by ourselves for Messiah. We're going to wait for God to come in his glory and rescue his people. And so they left. And they went to this place called Qumran. Now, many Essene communities separated from the wider Jewish population at this time and located themselves in various places. So not just in Qumran, there were other Essene communities all throughout Judea and Galilee. Qumran was a marginal splinter group of the Essenes. They are most notable for writing at least possessing what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I got some cool pictures. This is the what would have been the Essene community. These are some caves that were around it. See this little cave right here? This is the cave. Either this is the exact cave or one very similar to the one that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in. So if you don't know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, they were found in 1946 and were continued to be found until 1956. And they were made up. This is actually where Qumran was. So if you remember our map, this is kind of almost the south eastern border of Israel. This is Qumran. So that's the area. This is kind of their communities. This is the ruins. It was a big community built up, and they had these caves all around it. And so they stored a lot of things in those caves. This is the ruins of the community. This is kind of what it may have looked like at that time, from what they can kind of build back up. This is a vase or a jar that those scrolls were found in. So there was lots of scrolls that continued to be found, and they kept them in these vases. They were found, like I said, in 1946. The story goes that a young boy that lived in that area was throwing rocks up and trying to get the rocks into those caves that were around the area. And he was throwing rock after rock. And one time he got one all the way in the cave, and he heard a shattering of pottery. And so, of course, as any curious boy would, he tried to find out what was in there, but he couldn't reach it, so he got some adults. When they came and found it, they found these ancient scrolls, thousands of years old, that were stored inside this pottery. They were kept almost perfect inside this pottery. What those scrolls were, we like to think of them as the Bible, but it wasn't just the Bible. Only 40% of them were Hebrew scriptures or Old Testament scriptures. 30% were Second Temple texts. If you're wondering what that is, that's like the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the book of Tobit, the wisdom of Ben Sirach. These are texts that were written during the time of the Second Temple. This is past our Old Testament, but not the Gospels or the New Testament either. And so that's a lot of what they found in there. 30% of it, so we have 40% was Hebrew Scriptures, 30% Second Temple literature. Then the other 30% was Essene manuscripts. That's why people believe that was a huge Essene community. It was manuscripts like the Community Rule, the War Scroll, and the Pesher on Habakkuk, and the Rule of Blessing. Just as a brief note, that Pesher on Habakkuk, that basically is a commentary. So they would have taken the prophet Habakkuk, and they would have written a commentary to go along with it, just like you might have today on your bookshelf. The difference is they related everything that was in the prophets to them. They thought that everything that was happening in the prophets that he was prophesying about was their time right now, and they were God's holy people, the Essenes. And the rest of the people in Israel, those were the evil people that in the end were going to be destroyed. So those are some very interesting manuscripts that we found. And of course, as we know, they back up the Bible. They back up just like what we have today, that was what was written way back then. So they increase our confidence in that we have the Bible that was written all the way 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The origins of the Qumran community, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls, are widely debated. Some even believe that they had Sadducean origins. They seem to have been started by someone who was referred to as the teacher of righteousness, that's what they called him, who didn't like the wicked priest, probably the Hasmoneans. They apparently followed this leader into the wilderness and focused on their mission, which was to, quite literally, prepare the way for the Lord out in the wilderness. Isaiah chapter 40. The central belief of this group was that they were the true heirs of the Jewish blessing and prophecies, all the way from the blessings and promises of Abraham, even through to the prophets. They read themselves and their situation into the biblical prophecies. Their struggles were the subject of biblical promises and deliverance and divine rescue. They were the ones that were going to be rescued, is what they believed. So we understand the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes. There's all these different communities. You might be wondering, what about the normal people? What about the ordinary Jews of the time? Not all Jews distinguished themselves on these party lines. Most of them had better things to do, like survive and work and earn a living and feed their family and help their sick relatives and marriages and deaths and babies and all these things that were happening as a part of everyday life. They couldn't become a separatist group, or they couldn't follow every single purity law of the Pharisees, and they certainly couldn't be these aristocratic Sadducees. And so most of these people had a normal day-to-day life. Most Jews held that their God and their heritage was sacred. It doesn't mean that they put off religion altogether. They found this was a very important thing for them. Most Jews didn't have ample time to discuss the latest teachings or heresy that was going around in the Galilee by Jesus or John the Baptist. But despite this fact, most common people cared deeply about their God and their religion. They prayed, They fasted. They went to synagogue. They went to Jerusalem for the feast. They did not eat pork or shellfish. They kept the Sabbath, and they circumcised their male children. While we may expect to find the common people to be deeply reflective theologians, we know that, or while we may not find them to be deeply reflective theologians, we know that they likely did the best they could to keep their allegiance and their Jewish heritage however they could. They tried, right? There was one thing that united all of the Jewish people. Every Jew in that time, and even today, there was really two things, principles that united them. That was one God and one people. Now, Judaism was anything but monolithic. There were lots of different sects of Jews. They all believed the Torah, but they argued fiercely over its interpretation. They all recognized the sanctity of the temple, but disagreed on its organization. They all hoped for God's deliverance, but they couldn't agree on what that might mean or how they might bring that about. And so we know that it was a deeply argumentative religion, but when it came down to it, two sacred truths held the Jewish people together in the face of their own disputes and their Gentile influence. And that was, like we said, one God, one people. Deuteronomy chapter 6. If you want to turn over there real quick, Deuteronomy chapter 6. For many Jews, especially the common people, this may have been the most important and the most well-known scripture for anybody that was living at that time. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. And then it goes on to say how you shall teach them to your children. You shall bind them on your forehead and on your hands and put them on your door. This was a prayer. In Jewish culture, this is called the Shema. Shema means hear. Hear, O Israel. Shema, O Israel. That's how they would have started their prayer. And they would have gone on to speak that the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You think, of course the Lord is one. What does that mean? They were surrounded by pagans. They were surrounded by people who believed in multiple gods. And so this stood out to anybody they came in contact with. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. He is the creator God. He is the one true master God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. Who? Israel. One God, one people. This was a prayer that was recited every morning upon waking. When your eyes opened, you said this prayer. Before you went to bed, you said this prayer. So this was a very important prayer. And it really helps you to understand the capsulized Jewish faith in that one prayer. One God, in the face of pantheons, Israel believed in one true living God. He created the heavens and the earth. He was not a tribal deity, but the universal and sovereign king. One people. The Israelites were the chosen nation of God, the people of his pasture, a nation of priests, his special possession, and, most importantly for us, a light to the nations, a light to the Gentiles. Understanding their history and heritage helps us to see what the Jews thought about Messiah. Given God's method of rescuing his people, looking for a war chief may seem sensible for many Jews and zealots. When you look at the Old Testament, what did God do to save his people? He sent someone that would give them a military victory. He sent judges. He sent kings. He sent warriors.